Hi, I'm Ally Alexsonshk, and I'm here today to present to you focusing on the formative. This video is made as just kind of a shortened version of this presentation. There are a lot of great video resources in this presentation, so that is included in the full version. On this video, I'm just going to kind of talk through the slides, so it will be much shorter than the actual presentation in full length. So we will begin with the objectives and again from the title we're talking about formative assessment here, and part of that formative assessment cycle is to begin by taking those learning standards and putting them into targets or objectives for your students and conveying that to them, presenting that to them so that they know where they're going, where they're expected to go, and you know where they're expected to go. So I did that with this very first slide, giving you objectives. So here are some of the objectives of the presentation. You can read through them, but basically analyzing your own teaching practices and others' teaching practices through these videos, looking at current assessment practices being used in your classroom, evaluating your own assessments, examining the formative assessment strategies, discussing how they can be implemented in your classroom, evaluating examples of formative assessment, relating formative assessment ideas to current grading practices, reflecting and self-assessing on the ideas and practices discussed in our presentation here. And then after the presentation, so in my two objectives here, I tell you when this is going to happen. This is going to happen after the presentation, so that's important too, to encourage participants to implement at least two ideas from this professional development presentation, and then having follow-up sessions to discuss what worked, what didn't work, and then also evaluating the effectiveness of this presentation and the sessions to follow, and suggesting topics for future exploration. So as teachers find, oh, this strategy didn't really work well, let me try something else. Maybe they also get an idea, they do some research on their own, and they say, hey, I want to know more about this. And so then we kind of analyze that together and then explore it and look for resources on it. Okay, so we start this out with definitions, and I know all teachers already know the definition of assessment, and they probably know formative assessment, but let's just go over that. Assessment is the evaluation or estimation of the nature, quality, or ability of someone or something. And formative assessment really is a tool that teachers use to give feedback to students or guide their instruction. Feedback is a really key word with formative assessment. Good thing they both begin with F's. Easy to remember. Formative assessment is usually not included in a student's grade, especially with standards-based grading. A lot of that is based on summative assessment. And then it should also not be used to judge a teacher's performance. So you would, again, want summative assessment for that. And then I invite my participants to talk quite a bit in this presentation. So anytime there's the let's talk bubbles in the upper left corner, that kind of keys them in as here's a point where we're going to break away. You're going to talk with your colleagues. We're going to talk together as a group over some questions that I've presented for you. So here I've got, can formative assessment also be used as summative assessment? And can formative assessment count towards a student's grade? Which kind of those were a little, answered a little bit on the previous slide, but there are some situations where you could possibly use formative assessment as a summative assessment, and I have a video in this presentation which mentions that a little bit. Also in the lower right corner of the slide, you'll see a map. So just like I started with our final destination, that's where we're getting to, that's our location that we are driving to. Here's a map to symbolize like we're at one of those points along the way, and we need to keep continuing to go. So once we master this point, we can go on to the next, and that eventually will take us to our final destination, which is a great representation of what formative assessment is. Then I begin with this video of measuring learning and why is it so difficult. So pretty interesting because it features, yes, people in the education field, but also people in other professions talking about how it's so difficult to truly measure somebody's learning. without being able to go into their mind and know exactly what they're thinking. And then I ask my participants to kind of discuss the video. Then we go over formative assessment again. That formative assessment is incorporated into classroom practice and provides information needed to adjust teaching and learning while those things are happening. Okay, not at the end of them, it's during this whole process. It informs teachers and students about student understanding, and so that the student can make adjustments and the teacher can also make adjustments to ensure that the student's achieving those targets that they need to. And then summative assessment is given periodically to determine what students know and do not know. And you think of summative assessments more as a means to gauge at a particular point in time, and is very relative to the content standard. So think of a classroom summative assessment as, I've taught the material, we're ready to move on to the next. Let me see if you've mastered it or not. So I'm going to give you this short little assessment to check that. And then again, another opportunity for my participants to talk. And if you notice, I've also got at the upper right corner one of my objectives. I will identify and discuss current assessment practices being used in the classroom. So those are also present throughout my presentation here, reminding my participants that, you know, I am using those objectives that I've provided at the beginning of this presentation. So people are going to talk about what assessment looks like in their classroom and how has this even changed throughout your teaching career. And then they're also going to discuss summative assessment. Does it always have to be standardized? Does it always have to be on a pencil and paper? What types of summative assessment do you give in your classroom, or describe how you summatively assess your students? Okay, the next slide here is the keys to quality assessment. This is coming from Classroom Assessment for Student Learning, a book by Stiggins and a few other authors here, and they identify the 5 key dimensions of quality classroom assessment, which are that your assessment is coming from and designed to serve specific information needs of intended users, that you have clearly articulated and appropriate achievement targets, that they reflect student achievement, they yield results and are effectively communicated, and that they involve students in the assessment and record keeping and communicating those results to students as well. So 2 major themes with this is 2 questions that we can ask. How do we assess accurately, and how do we use assessment to benefit students? The goal is not to give it, grade it, and sort it. The goal is to improve it, use it to inform and engage the students in their learning. And that goal kind of does apply to both summative and formative assessment, especially with the fact, like if you look at the first one, giving it, grading it, and sorting it. You know, does the student see their results? Does the student know how they did on that test? And does the student know, you know, what they got wrong and how they can fix it? So even the summative assessments that we give in our classroom kind of turn formative in nature a little bit, because when the student reviews the results, you know, can they correct that on their own? Can they fix it on their own? Or do they need more instruction to be able to fix the things that they got incorrect or that they didn't master? All right, now I invite my participants to take a look at their assessment that they will have brought with them and evaluate it on these keys. So they're gonna take a look at it and see, can they identify clear purposes, why this is being given, what's the purpose of the assessment, are there clear targets on it, does it say on the test what it's assessing, is it a good design, is it a good method for that type of learning, or those students that they have. Are there any biases in it? And then with the communication, you know, how are they going to communicate the results, or how normally do they communicate these results? How do they report it? And again, all of these point down to this big idea of student involvement, that students need to understand the learning targets, they need to participate in this process, they need to track their own progress and communicate it as well. Okay, and then another opportunity for participants to discuss, you know, could they answer everything based on just that assessment example? What improvements could they make to their own test or assessment that they brought to make it a better quality? Okay, and then after they assess, I mean, we really again focus on this whole idea of student involvement in the assessment process. Then I provide time for them to stop and self-evaluate, asking them these questions. And again, I've included the objective from the first slide to show them that those are used throughout the presentation. And then here's a video from Sal with Khan Academy, Sal Khan, one of the creators of Khan Academy. And he presents this idea that, we should be teaching for mastery, not moving on to the next until students get there. And what he also identifies in his video is that with technology, we have the ability to do that. Whereas before we had all these websites and student learning systems and programs, that may have been a little bit more difficult. But now with technology, we have an increased ability to be able to teach for mastery and not move the students on yet who aren't quite ready. Let's get them closing those gaps and getting those skills that they need and to learn the things that they need to learn before they go on to the next learning. And then another opportunity to talk after that video. What did they agree and disagree with, and how can this work in your classroom? Considering their experiences, I asked them how they can provide more opportunities for differentiation in their classroom, because that really is kind of how you achieve that whole mastery of learning, is you're differentiating your students and your lessons. And then is technology something that they can use? And I know in my presentation, I would be giving this to teachers who have probably used some technology. So at this point, I may ask them for specific references to different websites, learning management systems, and programs that they've used to kind of achieve this differentiation with their students. Okay, now this slide goes on to the three main questions for formative assessment, is asking, where am I going, where am I now, and how can I close the gap? And how can we involve students in this process as well? And these 7 strategies of assessment for learning were taken again from that same book as I used before, Classroom Assessment for Student Learning. So these are the things that teachers and students should be asking to assess the learning process. All right, so then we get to the formative assessment cycles. This is one of my favorite slides here because I think it really lays it out for participants to see how this works. So the cycle begins with the standards and curriculum over here, and the standards that you're required to cover, any curriculum that your district or your school uses, and from that you start creating your learning goals and targets. So yes, while every teacher in the state of Ohio is in fact following the same set of standards for that grade level in that subject, however, we're all using different curriculum and we do have different students. So your learning targets may look a little bit different than someone else's. So learning targets really should be created at the teacher, at the educator level, or at that specific building, and not so much for the entire state of Ohio to follow those learning targets. So we begin by creating those learning goals or targets. Then we identify what criteria do our students need to show success, to show that they're mastering these. And so we identify that criteria. And then we also identify what evidence are we going to use to prove that students have learned this, to back that up. How are students going to show us that they've learned something? And then after that, we examine the student work, provide timely and specific feedback, which is really key in this process as well. That feedback and that work that we're examining is then informing our knowledge of our students and also helping us to plan for differentiation to inform our instruction. Okay, and then next we talk about how formative assessment, there's really 3 things that need to be mastered by teachers before they move on to more advanced strategies in formative assessment. So the 3 things are defining those clear learning goals for students, figuring out that criteria for success, and then identifying what tasks and activities that elicit evidence of student learning. And then once teachers master those three things, they can look at peer assessment, layering on the technology. So, okay, and here is the dimensions of formative assessment. And again, those three things are identified here with stars. And then it also includes the other things. So after you've mastered these three areas, then you can go on to, perfecting more questioning strategies for student learning, using evidence to inform ongoing teaching and learning, student peer feedback, collaborative culture of learning, student self-assessment. Okay, not saying that you necessarily can't do those things in your classroom. It's just really to have sound formative assessment, these three things of focus should really be perfected first and mastered first by the educator in explaining these to students, and then you can move on to those extra things. Because if you do this, if you do student peer feedback, but you haven't identified your learning goals or your criteria for success, it's probably going to be a mess and it won't be as effective as it could have been if you would have mastered these three things first and identifying those. Okay, and then in this is actually one of my favorite points of this presentation. This is where my participants are going to work with me to evaluate these displays of learning targets and formative assessment goals. So the first one is a display of I can statements, and I'll look at this and we'll, identify, yes, there's verbs with them and all that, but this really is just a learning target. It's not really saying what specifically the student needs to master. For example, I can sing by myself and with others. Okay, well, there's so many different things that you could do for that. And then what's the evidence that's going to prove that? Is there a specific song that you have to sing? Do you have to sing on key? Do you have to have the proper pitch? Do you have to sing the right notes? Do you have to be in tune with the song? Like, we don't really understand what singing means. Do you have to sing well, or is it just singing generally? So this could be more specific for students, but it's not necessarily saying that it's a terrible thing to have up in a classroom. It depends on what the purpose is. So if the purpose is kind of to introduce your students to things that they're going to be doing throughout the whole semester or throughout the whole school year, then this is okay. This is fine. But if your purpose is to use this and then have students perform tasks based on this and reference back to this, it's probably not the best way to demonstrate that for students. And as we go on, they get increasingly more descriptive. So this one is showing objectives for all different subjects together, which is nice, but and you see here the spelling patterns, they actually identify them. So a little bit more detail than the first one with just I can statements. They have the verbs circled in here, so that's important too. However, I think the look of this is not, it is neat, but it doesn't really appeal, especially to younger students. Maybe this would be in an older classroom, like middle school, but I can see with this word study one, the fact that there's those spelling patterns in it tells me that this is a younger classroom. So this may not be the best way to present that to kids. Plus, do they really understand what investigate means? A coordinate graph, main idea and details. Do those kids really understand those words? This one is a little bit more improved. So they, like I said, they increasingly improve with their detail. I like this one because it identifies key vocabulary for each objective. It has the objective, and then it also includes the criteria, or I guess like the evidence piece with it. So like for this math one, you can create and explain multiplication and division, but I will model, create, and describe multiplication and division problems. So it allows students to take a look at that and say, okay, I know I have mastered this when I can do these things. I can model it, create it, and describe it. So there's three things within that I need to do in order to master this objective. So a little bit more detail, which is nice. This one is, you have one objective. So I would assume from this that this teacher would be a single subject teacher in reading, because we're talking about identifying elements in mentor texts. So it tells what the students will do. I like how it identifies a number, 5 main elements of plot, and then I'll know I've got it when. So that's a different way of looking at this, giving students the criteria, the understanding, when they can do this, they know they've understood it. They know they've achieved that original objective. So that's a good relationship, showing them how they can achieve that. And then the essential question, actually, it's another good thing to put up there, because that could be used as summative assessment at the end of it, or you could even use it as a formative assessment, having them answer, journal about that question or respond to that question. You could also use it at the beginning of the lesson too as a pre-assessment, see what they know. And then this one, I liked this one because I know it wasn't as detailed with the objective, but I think it was very to the point. It gave a reason why they need to learn it, like what are they going to be doing with it. So that was good. And then I'll know I've got it when. So again, it gives them that final evidence piece, that criteria that they look at and say, okay, once I can do this, I know I've understood the objective. So none of these are perfect. This whole exercise was meant to just show the difference between displays of objectives. And again, it's up to each individual teacher to decide what they want to use, but they have to also have the reasoning behind that as well. So depending on what you're using it for and how you're using it will determine what it contains. And then they talk about how the learning targets would be displayed in their class. They throw around some ideas for that. Creating a plan, think about where they would locate them, display, the readability of them, how will it look to the students. And then here's a video from Battelle for Kids on their formative instructional practices, talking about a teacher who places the learning targets on everything she gives the kids, so that they're constantly reminded that, this is the objective, this is the target that, this task or activity that you're doing applies to. And then a little assessment time for my participants to kind of review of 3 key points here, what were already discussed in the presentation. And then again, I include that objective up at the top to remind them of that from the beginning. The student ownership example. So with this, they actually complete another formative assessment, kind of a little different take, similar to like a 3-2-1. But before the video, they're going to write down what do they already know about student ownership. During the video, they're going to write 3 things that stand out to them. And then after the video, they're going to reflect on how they can improve student ownership in their classroom and if they had any aha moments. And I believe this one really focuses on providing models to students. Okay, and then where to next? So we know where we're going, but where are we going next? So our next spot, we've covered all these things here. And our next big spot here is providing that timely and specific feedback to our students. So here are some examples of different formative assessments, and my participants are going to go through and describe how they would give feedback on an assignment if a student completed this. So like a 3-2-1, like what could some possible feedback look like for that? They can also discuss, how long would it take them to give feedback on this? Would they do it with a check plus, those types of things? Would they do it with a star or a stamp or something like that? Or would they actually give more specific feedback and make some notes to the student? And then here are some more examples of formative assessments. They could pick like 1 of these or 2 of these and kind of talk about what that feedback would look like. Again, same thing here, picking just a couple to talk about. This one was for an art class, so I thought that was a little bit more interesting because a lot of times our focus is on, the reading and the math and those academic classes and not so much the specials that we have, but all this can also be applied to specials. And then 2 videos here on how to help students. So we're giving them feedback and explaining to them, what they're missing, what they understand, and that is guiding them to improve. And then 2 examples of that happening in classrooms, in real classrooms. And then another video from Battelle for Kids about celebrating students every step in their learning process. Even the students who don't necessarily rate themselves at a high level, maybe they still are not sure about things, and the teacher's really intuitive to that and through formative assessment and really listens to the student of what they know and what they don't know, and then, celebrates that student has grown from where they started and they made some growth. It's not enough yet, it's not mastered yet, but they did make some growth. So they need to be celebrated for that and encouraged. That's all part of that motivation for them. So to do that, some examples would be to give them a reflection of their learning, have them identify things, kind of self-assess, and then have a conference using this paper that they reflected on. And then over here, if the teacher wanted to write and record all this information and then have a student conference based on this and talk about it. And then there's another example of student ownership and giving students choice in assessments. And then they reflect on the new ideas they learned and all of that there. And again, I included that final objective on that slide. And then I have an evaluation for all my participants to complete to evaluate how effective the presentation was. And I can show that here. So they basically just decide if they agree or disagree for different things. These are connected directly with the Ohio Standards for Professional Development for each one. And then a little bit about the presenter at the bottom. And then an opportunity for them to share any questions or thoughts they have about that presentation.